In order to understand how the Roman Church got to where they were, a disunified church, let's talk about how the church at Rome was founded and a key event in its early history. Now, no one knows exactly who founded the church in Rome. You're probably aware of the teaching within the Roman Catholic Church that Peter founded the church at Rome and was its first pope. Obviously, there's a whole line of inquiry to go into in discussing that teaching, but there's simply no historical proof that Peter founded the Roman church. There's no documentation, there's no evidence to be able to say, okay, Peter founded the church at Rome. And even if there was, you still got a long ways to go and other things to discuss before arriving at the teaching that he was the first pope. But again, different topic. Someone with systematic theology or historical theology can take that one up perhaps in another discussion. But for our purposes, without that historical proof that Peter founded the Roman church, we need to look elsewhere for the church's founding. And what's most likely is that there were pilgrims from Rome who came to Jerusalem for the Feast of Pentecost. You read about this in Acts 2, and this is the well-known story where the Spirit of God comes down on the church and the tongues of fire appear over the different people's heads, and as the word is proclaimed, each people group or language group, we might say, hears the gospel in their own tongue. And at one point, a recitation is given, a list of all the places that the people are from. And among that list is Rome. And I believe that's Acts 2:10 for the specific reference to Rome. So it's very possible, it's not a stretch at all to surmise that those pilgrims from Rome, Jewish pilgrims mind you, because they're coming to Jerusalem for the Feast of Pentecost, eventually returned to Rome, now as believers in Jesus Christ, and started worshiping God according to how God had revealed himself in Jesus. And when we look at other Christian history, that this might have actually been still originally as part of a Jewish synagogue, but over time becoming a separate assembly, as Christians were no longer welcomed as part of the synagogue. So these Jewish believers from Rome, they believe in Jesus on the day of Pentecost, they return to Rome, and they start worshiping Jesus, eventually forming a Christian assembly in Rome. Now what this means then is that this original Christian assembly in Rome was predominantly Jewish. They were welcoming Gentile believers, and over time Gentiles are progressively joining this assembly. But it very likely began as a majority Jewish assembly. And this is also supported and backed up by historical records which indicate a large Jewish population in Rome. So far historically everything checks out. Then in AD 49, a major event took place. Again, AD 49, so not even, or maybe just around 15 years removed from the resurrection of Jesus. Listen to this statement from Suetonius. He's a Roman historian, and this comes from his work, The Life of Claudius. And Claudius was a Roman emperor. Suetonius writes, "Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome." And by the way, this expulsion is referred to in Acts 18:2. So notice what's going on. Constant disturbances by the Jews at the instigation of Chrestus. And that title or name Chrestus is very similar to the Greek word Christos, from which we get our English word Christ. So it is very likely that Chrestus is a misreading of Christos. He got a letter wrong, but when we read in this Roman document about Chrestus, it is probably a reference to Jesus. there was a series of disturbances among the Jews due to this crustus. Now again, we're removed from the time of Jesus' earthly ministry, so it's not as if Jesus is going around causing these disturbances. Rather, what's most likely going on is that Jewish unbelievers are clashing with Jewish believers. Like I said, in the early days, Christianity was still viewed as an intra-Jewish movement. But over time, that relationship began to disintegrate. And so you can imagine a situation, especially if you read the book of Acts, where this happens more than once, in which members of the synagogue clash with followers of Jesus. It's a instigation or a disturbance, so to speak, over this Christus or Christos. And here's the deal. The Roman emperor doesn't want civil unrest. These kinds of disturbances are not only a problem. Nobody likes riots. Nobody likes fights. But on top of that, whenever you have disagreements over religion in the Roman Empire, this is also viewed as a disturbance of civic unity. Now, not going to go down this rabbit trail, but again, in the early history of the church, there are times when the Roman government is happy to just leave Christians alone and not worry about them. But if there's problems and the Christians come before them, that this is a later policy that eventually was adopted, the Romans might say, hey, look, offer a sacrifice to Caesar and we'll let you go. Why do they want them to do that? Show us that you're not enemies of the state. Show us that you're not a threat to civic unity. Show us you're loyal to the emperor by offering a sacrifice. Now that would be problematic, but show us your loyalty and we'll let you go. So I refer to that, and again, that was a later policy. But I refer to that all to say that kind of gives us a window into the mindset of the Romans and how they viewed religious disturbances or problems with Christians. This is a threat to civic unity. This, if it gets out of control, can destabilize our empire. And we can't have that. So if the Jews are fighting over this Christos, Claudius' solution, throw them out of Rome. They're causing trouble. They're fighting over this Christos. He's not interested in like a long-term, detailed investigation. Just, hey, people are rioting, throw them out. And again, remember, early on, Jewish Christianity, Christians are viewed as part of the synagogue. It's an intra-Jewish movement. So if all the Jews got to go, that's all the Jews, both non-believers and believers in Christ. So a large majority of the Christian church in Rome suddenly had to go. Now, that edict was rescinded after Claudius' death. But now Jewish Christians are returning to a largely Gentile church. So the church didn't fall apart while the Jewish Christians were gone. Instead, the minority became the majority. And when the original majority was allowed to return, they were now the minority. And that produced great tension in the church, especially in the areas of Jewish customs, food, and holy days that we saw in Romans 14 and 15. I mean, just think, just imagine for a moment how things would change in your church if a smaller group's way of doing things suddenly became the status quo. So maybe for years, a certain group is in the majority and things are done mostly their way. Suddenly, the minority, things are now being done their way. And maybe it's even in some areas that are controversial or that you're not comfortable with. What kind of disputes do you think might happen in your church? I mean, this is a very real situation both then and now. We might see it generationally, we might see it in issues related to programs or worship. You just fill in the blank on how it goes down in your church. But Paul was dealing with a situation like that. And so he wrote this letter to address those problems that we've considered in order to promote unity in the church. And the teaching of Romans was the truths and the admonitions and the loves and the way of thinking that he believed would lead to that unity. And that Paul, writing under the inspiration of God, is God saying to us, this is what will lead to a healthy and unified church. That's one of the purposes of Romans.